Hello and welcome. This is Wilrens for Create a Learning Site, the place to go deeper in your understanding of the Bible. I continue my exploration of the conquest of Canaan as part of my gradual approach to the 1400-page book about the violence of God in the Old Testament, put out by Gregory Boyd, entitled The Crucifixion of the Warrior God. I still haven't started reading it. This issue is all about the book of Joshua. If taken at face value, Joshua may be the most violent book in the Old Testament. What do we make of this book today? And what does that peculiar Hebrew word cherem mean that plays such an important role in Joshua? The accompanying letter and block entry to this issue is very long. I've cut the text in half for this recording. If you want more, especially references and quotations, you need to go to the website at www.wilrens.org to get the full story. At least the application of Joshua doesn't seem to be too hard. We find things to apply to our own lives. Fortunately, rightly, doesn't seem to inspire today's Christians to acts of violence. Instead, this book builds up our faith, challenges us to pursue God's goals for us, empowers us to conquer our destiny and take possession of our inheritance. The land in the book of Joshua really stands for our life. The book teaches us not to compromise. We readily understand the Canaanites and relationships with them as the equivalent of giving room to sin, the devil, evil in general. And this translates into the New Testament equivalent of putting off the old self and putting to death the works of the flesh. So far, so good. But at the time, the Israelites were killing real people, not fighting sin. And what do we make of that? In dealing with this question, we need to look at the text and we need to look at the historical context. First, the text. When we turn to the actual battle accounts in Joshua, it stands out how repetitive and formulaic they are. Certain phrases keep reappearing. It also stands out how absolute and complete these statements are. Words like all, every, and none abound. Here's a sample of a few repeated and stereotypical phrases. I have given X, Y into your hand, devoted for destruction. That's literally cherem, whatever that means. And Israel struck them down until there was left none that survived or escaped. They struck them with the edge of the sword. He left none remaining. Turns out that all of this is remarkably like other conquest accounts that we have from the ancient world. The campaign accounts that we have in Joshua may be characterized as follows. They are formulaic, they are repetitive, stereotypical, and hyperbolic. That we are dealing with, by our standards, rather exuberant hyperbole becomes clear when we pay attention to certain details elsewhere in the book of Joshua, and even more so when we compare the conquest accounts in Joshua and Judges. In the second half of Joshua, there's clear evidence that the Canaanites have not been driven out and certainly haven't been destroyed or exterminated. And a quick scan through Judges 1 reveals even more clearly the continuing presence of the Canaanites in strength. Important to keep in mind at this point is cities were small. Their inhabitants counted in the hundreds or perhaps in some cases some thousands. You're looking here at the ancient site of Megiddo, not unimportant city in ancient Israel. It's not very big. We should not bring our concept of city to the text. These were small villages. They were probably military and administrative centers inhabited by the king, his army, his staff. The bulk of the population lived in small villages spread out in the countryside around each city. It therefore made sense to target the cities. It would be sort of the equivalent of marching into Somalia or Afghanistan and taking out the warlords and their power bases. In reality, therefore, these were disabling raids. Joshua knocked out important power centers and centers of opposition to Israel's settlement. Look beyond the formulaic hyperbole, and the campaigns seem to have been relatively modest affairs. So far the text. Now context. How did other nations communicate military successes? Lawson Younger published a thorough study of conquest accounts from the ancient world in 1990. It documents numerous parallels between these accounts and the one we have in Joshua. A few examples. You're looking here at the Meremta stele, which mentions Israel in one line. It reads here, Yanoam is made non-existent, Israel is laid waste, and his seed is not. Now, this text dates from just before 1200 BC. Israel was still a young nation and had a long way still to go in its existence. It was far from not and laid waste. This stele comes from Egypt and was authorized by Pharaoh Thutmose III, who reigned in the 15th century. One fragment. The great army of Mitanni, it is overthrown in the twinkling of an eye. It has perished completely, as though they had never existed. Well, in reality, Egypt fought many more battles against this very army of Mitanni. This is the Mesha stele, set up by the king of Moab, Mesha, around 840 BC. I hesitated to include this example because it dates from long after Joshua. However, nothing suggests a literary form of campaign accounts and the underlying outlook changed much during these centuries. So here we go. One fragment reads, And the men of Gad dwelt in the country of Ataroth, that's east of the Jordan, close to Moab. Mesha states, I assaulted the wall and captured it and killed all the warriors of the city for the well-pleasing of Chemosh and Moab. And I removed from it all the spoil and offered it before Chemosh in Kiriath. And Chemosh said to me, Go take Nebo against Israel. And I went in the night and fought against it from the break of day until noon. And I took it and I killed in all 7,000 men, but I did not kill the women and maidens, for I devoted them to Ashtar Chemosh. To summarize this, Younger's study shows quite conclusively that Joshua is written in accord with the rhetoric and conventions of ancient Near Eastern conquest accounts. Such accounts narrate history in a highly rhetorical, stereotyped, figurative fashion and utilize substantial hyperbole, narrating battles in terms of total annihilation of everyone. To read these accounts as though the author were literally affirming that total extermination had taken place is simply to misread them. Younger's study convincingly proves that these accounts were not intended as straightforward and factual historical records. The accounts are ruled by conventions that were familiar to the readers. Different from us, they would not have misunderstood these texts. It's the equivalent of a modern-day statement in the newspaper that the other team was slaughtered. Everyone knows what that means. Somewhat surprisingly, Younger does not point out what to me seems significant differences between Joshua and other accounts. The aim of the Assyrian conquest accounts is intimidation, to instill fear and trembling. The Hittite accounts complain about betrayal and unfaithfulness and aim for vengeance and punishment. The Egyptian accounts glorify Pharaoh, at times beyond human likeness. Now, what is the point of the Hebrew account? How is it different? The Israelite account celebrates God's faithfulness in keeping and fulfilling his promise. It does not establish a king, but a nation. It rebuilds faith as it sets the standard for what God's people, all of them, not merely the king, can do if they are obedient. Different from many other accounts, Joshua is not in the I form. The narrative does not elevate Joshua, nor does he boast in the way the kings in other conquest accounts do. In the previous issue, I searched for God's command to practice cherem in the Torah and found very little. Only once does Moses state that this is God's command, Deuteronomy 20, but there is no instance where God is described as actually giving this command directly. The situation in Joshua is not very different. Again, if you want full references, you'll have to go to the website at wilrens.org and read the text of this issue. But here's a summary. The book of Joshua does state a few times that this was done just as the Lord commanded, but only a few times, and it remains unclear when, where, and how God commanded this. So, am I going too far when I suspect God of being reluctant to order cherem and destruction? Maybe because the narrator does not appear to show any such reluctance. Still, the rarity of any direct command compared with its abundant practice seems significant. What does it mean that other conquest accounts, like Joshua, also speak freely of their God's involvement in battles, warfare, and killings? Was it so normal to see one's God's involvement in everything that the Israelites could not think of their conquest in any other way, thus, perhaps, ascribing to God more than what he wanted or had ordered? Well, I hesitate to go this far because the text does, however infrequently, make God speak of cherem and destruction. It's not in every case Israel's initiative. Instead, for the solution, I turn once again to accommodation. God is adjusting to the world as it was in order to enter it and, eventually, change it from the inside out. Before I say more about this, about accommodation, a word on cherem. Conceptually, the Israelites lived in a world completely different from ours. Most of us consider war as something secular, not a religious activity, except for special cases of holy war. In the ancient Near East, war was never secular. It was an activity in which the gods fully engaged. The rationale for war was therefore also entirely different from the rationale of modern warfare. Karl von Clausewitz, the famous Prussian theoretician of war, coined the aphorism that war is the continuation of politics by other means. Not so back then. War was the continuation of religious devotion with other means. Like it or not, and I suspect God did not, there are hints in the Old Testament that imply a negative view of war, like Isaiah chapter 2. This was the world of Moses and Elijah and David. This was how the Egyptians and the Syrians and Hittites viewed the world. War was fully integrated with religion, and therefore with the conceptual world of holiness and purity, another concept that is difficult for us to grasp. We simply don't understand the world this way, within a matrix of pure and impure, holy and unholy, and it is in this matrix and in the ancient, fully religious outlook on life and war that cherem has its place. This makes it impossible for us to fully comprehend cherem. We are too far removed from this world. Two things may help: an improved definition and a look at the practice of other nations. This is the definition given by Walton and Walton. Cherem is the removal of something from human use. The emphasis is not on the object, but on everyone around the object. No one shall make use of this. Destruction, when it occurs, is a means to an end. I think this makes a lot of sense. Defined like this, cherem can be applied to gold and other things, but also to people and locations. The execution of cherem may at times require destruction through fire or the sword. At other times it may simply mean setting something apart, devoting it to the Lord. This definition of cherem has the strength of covering all the different examples of its use. To remove something from human use, when applied to the Canaanites, meant first and foremost not to engage in relationships with them. Its essence is separation, not extermination. In case of resistance, it might become necessary to kill, but cherem is not a call to extermination. For these reasons, translating cherem as devoting for destruction misses the point. To place something under a ban comes closer to the original sense. In addition to all this, Walton and Wanton argue that cherem is not so much directed against individuals, but especially against their community identity. This is why there is such a focus on kings and cities, even though only a small portion of the population lived in cities, because these are the carriers and backbone of such identities. Take out the kings and their cities, and the identity collapses. Cherem, therefore, does not require Israel to pursue individual Canaanites and kill them. As I argued in the previous issue, Israel had a concept of cherem before God ever spoke of it. And in fact, God spoke very little of it, as I've shown. We find something like this concept among other nations as well. This is because Israel did not live in a vacuum, but was influenced by these nations. On many points, it shared their worldview and understanding. Wars were fought for and with the gods, or God. In this context, it made sense to devote booty or gains, such as a city, to them, or to him. Or perhaps more accurately, it made sense to acknowledge that it was his from the beginning and not a gift, since it was his war and his victory. The spoils were therefore legitimately his as well. The Hittites in Asia Minor had such practices, and in 2 Kings, chapter 19, the term cherem is used by the Assyrian official to describe what the Assyrian kings had done to numerous other nations. And we've also read what Mesha, king of Moab, states, without using the term, but describing a somewhat similar practice. One of my questions in the previous issue was whether Israelite practice resembled that of other nations at the time. If so, that would open the door to a solution, but as I wrote, I wanted to see evidence for this. I think the evidence is there. The Israelites lived in a world in which all wars were divine wars, fought for and with the respective god of the nation. Other nations occasionally practiced their own form of cherem. Admittedly, the amount of evidence is limited, but it exists. This was not an isolated practice, but an integrated part of looking at the world, with different eyes. Therefore, unlike today, no one in the ancient world would have been shocked reading the conquest account of Joshua, including cherem. It fitted right in. This was normal. As a result, the ancient reader would also have recognized the hyperbole and would have known how to understand it. What Moses envisioned and Joshua executed was a whole lot less than a campaign of extermination. And with all this, we are dealing with accommodation. God entered the world of the Israelites and related to them within their conceptual framework in order to change it. Jumper Longman and Daniel Reed have proposed a 5-stage model for the progressive revelation that begins with the Exodus and develops the theme of God as the divine warrior. Stage 1, established through the Exodus and the conquest. Here God is a warrior who fights on behalf of his people Israel against their flesh and blood enemies. Stage 2, God fights against and judges unfaithful Israel in the Old Testament. 3, God will come as warrior, the prophetic expectation of the day of the Lord and deliverance in the future. And then 4, Christ comes as paradoxical conqueror who defeats principalities and powers on the cross. And 5, Christ will return as warrior and judge. Recognizing progressive revelation and divine accommodation enables us to move beyond an Old Testament understanding to a fuller New Testament understanding of God, but without discarding or condemning the Old Testament record. But neither do we have to embrace the earlier stages as if they reveal God's standards in full. This developing understanding of God as a warrior is intimately connected with an unfolding revelation of the true war story, which enables us to pinpoint the real enemy, not the nations, but Satan. God started concrete in a world full of real flesh and blood warfare. God revealed himself as a warrior. Later in the story, he reveals what kind of war he is fighting and thereby redirect the war effort of his people. Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down. Thus celebrates the text of a well-known so-called spiritual that has inspired millions. The book of Joshua is a brilliant story, brilliantly told, with a powerful message of empowerment. Obviously, considering the origins of this song, its message was greatly appreciated precisely by those without power, black slaves in America. It's a shame that my whole effort here seems to be geared toward the dark side of this book and largely ignores its positive message. But then, in today's world, people ask serious questions about Joshua, questions that previous generations perhaps didn't ask. And as Francis Schaeffer taught us, serious or honest questions deserve serious answers. Still, don't let these questions rob us of the enjoyment of this book and of the benefits of its message. Let's go out and fight the battles of Jericho.
The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience. The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience. The show will be starting in just a few moments.